There is a number that gets cited and then quietly moved past. In 2021, for the first time in recorded American history, the drug overdose death rate in rural areas surpassed the rate in cities. Rural Americans were dying of overdoses faster than urban Americans, faster than any population in the country. And when most people hear that, if they hear it at all, they absorb it as a data point about drugs, about fentanyl, about a specific crisis affecting a specific kind of place. But it is not a number about drugs. It is a number about what happens to a community after something deeper breaks. Since 2010, 46% of rural counties in the United States have lost population. 46%. That is not selective decline. That is a broad, steady, nationwide contraction. Nearly 3 million people left rural America in a single decade. And the communities they left behind did not simply shrink. They changed in a different way, the way a body changes when it loses something it needed, not just for comfort, but for function. 181 rural hospitals have closed since 2010. Another 700 are currently rated at risk of closure. There are counties in this country, whole counties, where there is no emergency room within 30 miles. Where a heart attack at 2 a.m. means a 40-minute drive on a 2-lane road in the dark. And 5.5 million manufacturing jobs disappeared between 2000 and 2010. Mostly from towns that had exactly one of them. These numbers are usually presented as economic statistics. And they are. But they are also describing something that economics doesn't have a language for, the systematic removal of the scaffolding that made ordinary life in these places feel coherent, purposeful, and worth staying for. Something deeper than poverty is happening in small-town America. And that something has a name. We just haven't been using it. Think about what actually happens to a town when the factory closes. Not in the first year. Not the layoffs, the missed mortgage payments, the obvious immediate damage. Think about what happens over 15 years. In the first year, the factory closes and the union hall closes with it. The union hall was where people organized. Yes, but it was also where the Christmas party was, where the bowling league met, where the scholarship fund for local kids was administered, where on a Tuesday night, you might run into the same 12 people you'd been running into on Tuesday nights for 20 years, and where that repetition had quietly become the texture of a life. The union hall closes, that Tuesday night disappears. By year 3, the anchor businesses on Main Street, the ones that survived on the disposable income of 500 employed households, are gone. The diner goes first, then the hardware store, then the independent pharmacy. What replaces them are dollar stores. And dollar stores do not sponsor Little League teams. They do not know your name. By year 7, the young people are leaving. Not because they don't love the place, many of them do. Painfully, in the way you love something you know you can't afford to keep. They leave because there is no job that will let them stay. And each departure removes another node from the social network that remains. The school enrollment drops. The elementary school consolidates with the one in the next county over. The school that once anchored the neighborhood, the place where every parent knew every teacher. Where Friday night football was the week's main social event is now a 30-minute bus ride away. By year 12, the hospital closes. The one where every person in the county was born, where their parents died, where the doctor knew their name without checking a chart. It closes because it was running at a loss, which happened because the insured working families moved away, which happened because the factory closed. The nearest emergency room is now in a different county. By year 15, and this is the part that is hardest to see from the outside, the people who remain are not just poorer. They are living in a place that no longer resembles the place where they built their identity. The church congregation has thinned to a fraction of what it was. The civic club folded for lack of members. The diner where everyone met is a dollar store now. The hospital that delivered their children is an empty building with its windows boarded. They are still there. They didn't leave, and they are watching their home disappear around them while still living inside it. That experience has a psychological name, and understanding it is the only way to understand what the overdose statistics are actually measuring. In 2003, An Australian environmental philosopher named Glenn Albrecht published a paper describing a psychological condition he had observed in communities living through the destruction of their home environments. He coined a word for it that did not previously exist. Solastalgia. Solastalgia is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is longing for a place or time you can no longer access. It hurts because you cannot return. Solastalgia is different. It is the grief of watching your home change beyond recognition while you are still living in it. The pain is not about the past. It is about the present, a present that no longer matches the place where your identity was formed, where your relationships were built, where your sense of self still lives. The people who stayed in these towns are not nostalgic. They are grieving. Right now. In real time, without language for it, without cultural permission to call it what it is. Albrecht's insight is that solastalgia undermines identity, agency, and mental health in ways that persist as long as the environmental loss continues, which, in these communities, is indefinitely. It is not a grief with an end date. The loss does not complete. Every morning you wake up in the same house where you've lived for 40 years and walk out to a main street that is no longer the main street you built your life around. The grief begins again, without resolution, without a word for it on most days. This framework reframes everything. The economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton spent years trying to understand why non-college educated white Americans were dying at dramatically increasing rates from what they called deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdose, alcoholic liver disease. Their research documented the rise clearly. What they found when they tried to explain it changed how they thought about the entire problem. The death rate correlated with economic loss. Yes. But the correlation was stronger with something else. The collapse of what Case and Deaton called meaning infrastructure, not income. Meaning, the job that organized your day, the union that gave you solidarity with people like you, the church that placed your ordinary life inside a larger story, the diner where you were known. These structures didn't just provide community, they provided the framework inside which suffering had meaning and hardship could be endured. Viktor Frankl wrote from inside a concentration camp that humans can tolerate almost any degree of suffering if it has meaning, and that they collapse not primarily from pain, but from meaninglessness. The crisis in small-town America is not that people are poor. It is that the meaning infrastructure that once made poverty bearable, the dignity of skilled work, the solidarity of organized labor, the social recognition of being a known person in a coherent community has been stripped away at industrial scale. Solastalgia compounds this because when you are grieving your home while still living in it, the grief itself becomes part of the background noise of daily life, indistinguishable. After a while, from just how things feel, it gets attributed to depression, to getting older, to just the way life goes. The actual cause, the structural loss of the psychological scaffolding of a life, remains unnamed. Undiagnosed, untreated, and unnamed grief, sustained over years, drives people toward anything that quiets it. Anything at all. The overdose statistics are not primarily a story about drugs. They are a story about pain that has no other address. In 1972, the psychologist Martin Seligman published findings from a series of experiments that would become one of the most cited papers in modern psychology. He had subjected dogs to repeated, inescapable electric shocks. When subsequently given the opportunity to escape when the exit was clearly available, the dogs didn't take it. They had learned through repeated, inescapable experience that their actions had no effect on their circumstances. They stopped trying, even when trying would have worked. He called this learned helplessness. The parallel to communities that have spent 30 years watching factories close, watching promises made and broken, watching economic development programs arrive, generate press releases, and quietly disappear. The parallel is not rhetorical. It is documented. The sociologist Robert Putnam spent decades mapping what he called social capital, the networks of trust, reciprocity, and civic engagement that function as a community's immune system. in dense civic environments, social capital buffers hardship. When one household loses a job, the network activates referrals, shared resources, collective problem solving. When a factory closes in a high social capital community, the community organizes a response, want to a response. But when social capital collapses first, when the union hall, the civic clubs, the churches, and the local organizations that built it have already been hollowing out for a decade, the community's immune system is gone. What arrives is not a community managing a crisis. It is isolated individuals, each managing it alone. Putnam documented a 25 to 50% decline in civic participation across the United States since the 1970s. PTA membership, union membership, bowling leagues, neighborhood associations, church attendance, the steepest drops occurred in the communities that experienced the most severe economic shocks. The communities that needed their immune system most were the ones that had already lost it. The result in communities that have been through 30 years of this looks like apathy from the outside. Low voter turnout, poor attendance at civic meetings, resistance to outside initiatives and economic development plans, fatalism. But this is not apathy. It is a rational adaptation. When your community has watched 5 economic development programs arrive, generate a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and disappear without producing lasting change, when the politician comes every 4 years with a factory announcement that never materializes, you don't keep showing up for the next one out of stubbornness or stupidity. You stop showing up because showing up has not changed anything. And the experience of that pattern is identical to what Seligman's experimental subjects experienced. Learned helplessness is not a character flaw. It is what happens to any intelligent organism, human or animal, after sufficient repetitions of inescapable loss. Or this is a correct conclusion drawn from available evidence, and it is one of the reasons why externally designed economic recovery programs in distressed rural communities consistently underperform. They are trying to unlock a door from outside a room where the people inside have learned, with good reason, that doors here don't open. The thing about the communities that have broken this cycle, and some have, is that none of them did it through an economic initiative alone. Every documented case of meaningful rural revitalization that holds across time involves something that precedes economic recovery. The rebuilding of local institutions, not the creation of new ones invented by outside consultants. The reinvestment in the ones that already exist, or the revival of ones that were lost, the civic organizations. The local schools, the gathering places that allow a community to recognize itself again, to experience collective agency before the economic results arrive to justify it. You cannot restart an immune system with an IV drip. You have to give the system the conditions in which it can begin to regenerate its own capacity. There are towns in this country that were in the same position, the same factory closures, the same population loss, the same hollowing, and came back. Not to what they were before. Not back to 1975 with its specific economic configuration. Back to something else. A coherent community with a functioning civic life and a reason to stay. The pattern in those towns does not look like what economic development policy usually prescribes. It does not lead with a new employer, a tax incentive package, or a downtown revitalization grant. It leads with something quieter. And usually it leads with local people who refuse to let the story be only a story of loss. In McDowell County, West Virginia, one of the most economically devastated counties in the country, once described in national media as evidence that American decline was irreversible, a coalition of local residents, the local school system, and a handful of committed outside partners spent a decade not trying to attract a new industry, but trying to rebuild the conditions for collective civic life. Free community Wi-Fi, school-based community centers that stayed open evenings, local apprenticeship programs run by the people who actually lived there, not by consultants who flew in. The economic results are modest. The county is still poor by national measures, but the civic fabric, the sense of being a community with agency, with a shared story that is not only a story of loss, has measurably changed. Young people who left have started coming back, not in large numbers, but in numbers. What these communities have discovered is the same thing the research has consistently shown. Economic recovery follows civic recovery, not the other way around. When people experience themselves as part of a community with agency, when the Tuesday night gathering exists again in some form, when the institution that carries collective identity has been rebuilt, the conditions for everything else become possible. In Greensburg, Kansas, a town of 2,000 that was almost completely destroyed by a tornado in 2007, the community made a deliberate decision to rebuild not just the buildings, but the civic character of the town. They embedded community gatherings, local decision-making, and shared identity into the reconstruction process itself. The result was a place that functions not because it recovered to its previous state, but because the shared experience of rebuilding gave it a new story to inhabit. The story is not the jobs came back and then the community recovered. The story is the community rebuilt its capacity to act together, and then different things became possible, including, in some cases, the jobs. This distinction matters because it tells you what to look for in a genuine recovery and what to be skeptical of when someone promises one. An outside investment that does not engage the local civic capacity it lands in will not produce lasting change. It will be the sixth ribbon-cutting ceremony that disappears in 3 years. The thing that precedes lasting change is not an economic input. It is the reconstruction of the community's immune system, its social capital, its institutions, its shared story about itself. That reconstruction is slower. It is less photogenic. It does not have a ribbon-cutting ceremony. But it is the only version that holds. Here is what this story looks like from a distance. A set of economically failing communities making increasingly desperate choices, producing political outcomes that puzzle or frighten people who don't live there. That is the version that gets covered. That is the version that gets assigned causes, drugs, lack of education, resistance to change, cultural backwardness. Here is what the research actually shows. Communities of people experiencing solastalgia, meaning collapse and learned helplessness in that order, as a consequence of specific economic policies and institutional disinvestments that were made by specific people with specific interests, far from the places that absorbed the damage. These are not the same story. The first story asks, what is wrong with the people? The second story asks, what was done to the community? The answer to that question is very different. And it matters because you cannot solve a structural problem by fixing the people it was done to. The urban-rural divide in this country is not primarily a cultural divide, though it has become one. It began as something more specific. The concentrated experience of a particular kind of institutional loss in communities that did not have the geographic or economic diversification to absorb it. The political rage, the cultural retrenchment, the resistance to institutions that seem not to have noticed. These are not the origins of the divide. They are the symptoms of a grief process that has been running for 25 years without language, without acknowledgement, and without a political establishment willing to honestly describe what happened. Genuine empathy, not the performative kind. Not the kind that watches a documentary and feels something for 30 minutes. Genuine empathy requires understanding the mechanism. It requires knowing that what looks like irrationality from the outside is a rational response to repeated inescapable loss. That what looks like cultural backwardness is solastalgia, grief of watching home die while still living in it. That what looks like political extremism is, in significant part, the political expression of learned helplessness in communities where nothing conventional has changed anything in a generation. You don't have to agree with the political expressions, but you have to understand their source before you can respond to it in a way that doesn't simply deepen the rift. The most concrete move available to most people watching this is not a policy vote, though that matters too. It is a perceptual shift. Stop seeing small-town America as a symptom of its own failure and start seeing it as a community in grief. Grief requires acknowledgement before it can move. It does not require your pity. It does not require your solutions. It requires the basic recognition that something real was lost, that the loss was real, that the people who absorbed it were not responsible for it, and that the appropriate response is not explanation but witness. Robert Putnam's Our Kids documented something that should disturb everyone who lives in a city and considers themselves economically comfortable. The gap in life outcomes between people who grew up in high social capital communities and people who grew up in their collapse is now larger than the gap produced by income alone. Where you grew up, the quality of the civic and social infrastructure around you now determines your life chances more powerfully than at any time in the last 50 years. This means the collapse of social capital in rural America is not a local problem. It is a national condition that is currently being measured in the diverging life trajectories of millions of American children, half of whom are growing up in communities whose immune systems were removed before they were born. If you want to do something with this, vote on local zoning decisions. The physical infrastructure of community, whether neighborhoods are walkable, whether there are third places, whether people can encounter each other without a car, is determined at the local level by decisions most people don't show up for. Support institutions that rebuild social capital directly, local libraries, community centers, civic organizations, not as charity but as infrastructure investment, because that is what they are. And when the political conversation turns to small-town America, ask the question that most of that conversation avoids. Not what is wrong with these communities, but what specific decisions made by identifiable actors over identifiable decades produce this outcome. That question has answers. Those answers point toward accountability. And accountability is where recovery actually starts. These communities are not failing. They are grieving. And grief, when it is witnessed honestly, when someone finally sits with it and calls it what it is, can move. The crisis is quiet. The grief is real, and it will not stay hidden forever.